Hello, I'm Wendy, and I've been out and about at a local nature reserve to find some ideas and inspiration for autumn painting.
Hello, it's a lovely autumn day and we've had a drive up to the Caern National Nature Reserve, which is near Tregaron in mid Wales.
I didn't have to go very far along the trail to find these hedgerows that were full of hawthorn berries, rose hips and colourful autumn leaves. I'll be painting some of these, and I've put timestamps that you can see on the progress bar and also in the description box below. This should make it easier to return to specific demonstrations if you wish to. Caern is a wetland of international importance, and it's made up of 3 raised peat bogs. The River Teivi and its floodplain form the centre of the reserve, and there's a unique mix of habitats, and it's a really wonderful place for plants and wildlife. There are 3 walking trails around the reserve, and today we took the boardwalk that leads to a large hide that had lovely views of the landscape. I was really spoiled for choice as to what to paint, but decided to work from the hedgerow photographs I'd taken, and also a little purple heather that I found hiding in the autumn grasses. This is going to be a short step-by-step demonstration showing how I paint autumn leaves. This is a hawthorn leaf, but I painted all the leaves in a similar way. It's a loose approach, using watercolour very transparently, wet into wet, mainly with just one layer of colour. I do work a lot from photographs, but as you can see here, I like to have some reference material to hand whenever possible. Here I'm putting on some masking fluid where some of the veins are and trying to make the lines as thin as possible. I'm using a very fine masking fluid brush that I bought from the Society of All Artists. They are available quite widely now though. Mix up some colours ready on your palette before you start. For this demonstration I used a warm yellow, which was New Gamboge, and for the reds I used a mix of rose madder, crimson alizarin and light red. If you're painting from your own reference samples, if you've been out collecting leaves, then obviously use some colours that will suit the leaves that you've collected. You might find you want to use a brighter red, and also a lot of the leaves will have some green in them as well. At the end of this demonstration I'll show you some photographs of some other leaves that I painted. As you can see, I'm dropping the colour into the leaf shape onto dry paper. In order to keep the colours bright and transparent, I'm not having them merge too much. I'm gradually adding some stronger colour here, but the layer underneath is still very wet, so I'm getting these nice wet into wet washes still working. I speeded the next little bit up because I apologise, it is a little bit out of focus. I mixed a dark brown using ultramarine and burnt sienna to paint the twig, and use the same mix for the dark edges of the leaves and the spots of dark colour in the centre. I also added a touch more of the brighter red in places where I felt it needed it. When the painting was totally dry, I rubbed off the masking fluid. A few of the lines were a little too wide, as you can see, but that's easily rectified by just using a little bit of the leaf colour. this next demonstration I'm painting rose hips, but I would paint berries like the hawthorn berries in a very similar way. The photograph is one of the actual rose hips on the nature reserve. It may have been partly the light, but they were much oranger than the ones I picked locally to help with this painting. I put a first coat of a light green on the stem, and then I mixed the colours for the rose hips. For the demonstration I just used cadmium orange and rose madder. If you wanted a stronger colour, then I would suggest using something like alizarin crimson in the mix. The rose hip is going to be painted wet into wet in one layer of paint to maintain the transparency of the watercolour. You can see here I'm putting a first coat of the cadmium orange on there, being very careful to leave that little bit of white paper to act as a highlight on there. Now I'm working on two of the rose hips at once here because I'm familiar with drying times. You may want to work just on one at a time. What I'm doing now is adding a progressively stronger mix of the rose madder into the cadmium orange. It's all being worked wet into wet all the time. It's a combination of the different colours and the tones that we're painting here that is giving this, hopefully is giving this feeling of roundness, of 3D-ness in the rose hips. I'm strengthening parts of the stem with a darker green, and what I find very useful is putting a little bit of the darker green just underneath the rose hip. Gives a little bit of shadow and a bit more form to the painting. And finally I'm painting what are probably the remains of the petals on the dog rose here. I'm using a very strong mix of burnt umber with ultramarine, but keeping it on the warm side. These were not as apparent on the rose hips in the photograph, but I think they make the painting more interesting and attractive. In this next demonstration, I'll be painting the rose hips in the same way as the previous one, but this time I'm putting on an experimental background behind them using salt and cling film. I've used these techniques in previous videos, and I'll put links to them in the description box below. I masked out the rose hips and the stems, damped the background with clean water and dropped colour into it. The paint was mixed progressively thicker and darker, but all the time I was working wet into wet. You can use any colours that appeal to you for the background. For this particular painting I used mixes mainly of cadmium orange, sap green with a little red, and the dark green was a mix of cadmium orange and Prussian blue. I'll speed the next little bit up. The next stage is a little sprinkling of table salt while everything is still wet, and then some cling film. You can put the cling film on all over or in a specific area. You can keep it loosely placed or you can press it down. That's why it's called an experimental background, because every time you do this sort of thing it's always going to be different. Let it dry completely before removing the masking fluid. I explained fully how I paint the rose hips in the previous demonstration to this, so I won't repeat it here, but I have recorded the painting process. I've included a sequence to show how I use kitchen roll to adjust the water and paint content of the brush. This is something I thought may be of additional help, particularly if you're just starting out in watercolour. I used a little white gouache with a touch of sap green, just to do a little fine tuning at the end. This is the final painting using all the background wash area. It's quite subjective how much of that you would use if you were to mount the painting or use it in something like a card. And here are two more that I did. Most of the bog flowers had gone over on the day we visited, but I did find a lovely heather, which is called cross-leafed heather. The purple was a lovely contrast to the warm autumn colours on the reserve. I enjoyed painting this. It was like painting a bunch of pink balloons. I painted the flowers using an increasingly strong mix of alizarin crimson, wet into wet. Looking at the photograph, this seemed quite an appropriate choice, but thinking back, the flowers did seem to be a little more on the purple side, so I don't think it would come amiss if I was to put, or you were to put, a little bit of blue in with the crimson. I painted each little flower in the bunch separately, and I didn't let the colours mix from one flower to the next. While the first 3 flowers were drying, I made a start on painting the stem with the whorls of leaves around it, using mainly sap green with a touch of red. I hope you can see that by giving the flowers a light side and a dark side, I'm separating them by tone rather than line to achieve form. Pulling out colour in watercolour is just as important as putting colour in. And in order to pull out colour, as you can see, what I do is I clean the brush and then get rid of excess water on some kitchen towel before I pull out the colour. The next section is speeded up a little bit. And there's my little bunch of pink balloons. And speeded up again, some final touches. Of course, I couldn't resist doing 1 or 2 experimental backgrounds. I hope you enjoyed the video and found it useful. We'll go back to coarse Karen again next year. I particularly want to find the wild sundews, insect-eating plants growing in the bog in the summer. That sounds like a really fun painting, doesn't it?